All right, hello everybody. This is Dr. Prino again. We're going to go ahead and go over a Chapter 8 review of areas that you should be concerned with when you start studying for the exam, which is next week. Again, it's not a comprehensive exam. Okay, reviews is just to give you an idea what to focus on. I want you to focus on these areas, but you're also responsible for all the readings as well. So as I go through the review, I'm going to try to point out some areas of interest. I'll try to elaborate the best I can, and like I did last time, I'm probably going to repeat myself, which means, you'll get a little extra bonus when I go through the different questions that you should be responsible for, or at least familiar with the information. When it comes to Chapter 8, you should be familiar with different classes of levers, okay, and their relationship to movement. So our Class 1 levers, are they diarthrotic, are they amphiarthrotic, synarthrosis, so forth and so on. When it comes to classes of levers, be familiar with, for example, if you nod your head yes with the occipital atlantal joint, what lever would that be? Okay, so we'll go through. I'll hit more levers in a second as well. Understand the term articulation. That kind of popped up a little differently, but overall, the whole entire concept of this chapter is to understand what does the term articulation mean, and be sure to just carry that concept with you through the next chapter as well. Sinuses and all the locations, right? The ethmoid sinus versus the sphenoid sinus, maxillary sinus. We know we have different sinuses in the face. Be familiar with where they are and what they do. Not what they do, but where they're located. Allow them with, hey, here's a bone. What structure does it relate to? Or here's a structure. What bone does it relate to? So, as I just said, structures of bones. So, for example, the sphenoid bone is probably one of the most complicated, misshapen bones of the body. So you should be familiar with, hey, it contains the foramen ovale, the foramen, optic foramen, foramen spinosum, pterygoid canal, right? So be familiar with the sphenoid bone, all bones, and the structures that are associated with those bones. We talk about the radial head, obviously it's on the radius. We talk about the medial malleolus. It's going to be on the tibia, right? Because that's the inside of your ankle as well. So kind of get a broad idea of what structures are on what bones. When it comes to the skull, know the sutures of the skull, what kind of joint is the suture, right? Is it a movable joint? It's not. It's a non-movable joint, but some research shows that it could be a movable joint. And of course, know all the bones of the skull and how they articulate together. Meaning, how do they, who's against who, right? Parietal versus parietal, with the occipital in the back and the frontal in the front. Hence the name, right? Let's see what else we got here. How they paired, how they go together, and all the sutures. When it comes to the concept of structures of bones, if we take the concept of a styloid, okay, styloid in Greek means a writing utensil. So when you write something, they use a styloid or a stylus, right? So be familiar with all the bones that contain a stylus, a styloid. So there's a lot of bones that contain the same structure called a styloid. So be familiar with that concept as well. All the facial bones, okay, I'm talking about the facial bones, not the skull or the calvarium area. I'm looking at the facial bones, maxillary, sphenoid, temporal, zygomatic, and so forth and so on. Excuse me. When it comes to structures of the bones and those that you could feel, okay, those that you could palpate, there's a couple of questions on there that may ask you, hey, can you palpate or feel this structure? Which kind of gives you an idea of, well, how well do you know the bones? How deep are they? Like, for example, if you were to touch somebody's neck in the back, you could feel the spinous processes and the lamina and sometimes the pedicles of the cervical spine. When it comes to those structures like the occipital condyles that connect to the C1 of the superior facets, you can't feel those, or you can't palpate those. You can feel the nuchal line on the back of your head, so forth and so on. So be familiar with some of those structures. When you go through the structures of bones and all those little structures, just think about, hey, can I feel that? Can you feel your funny bone? Absolutely. The lateral epicondyle of your humerus. That's what you feel. Actually, that's the lateral. The medial will be your funny bone, right? Medial epicondyle. Understand the fetus and all the bones and fontanelles. Know what fontanelles are. Know where they're located. When it comes to fetal bones, and I'll go over this again for the review, but be familiar with the concepts of how many bones do you start out with as a child and how many bones do you have as an adult, right? 206 as an adult. However, if you count the sesamoid bones and some other bones, then you have more than 206 bones. Be familiar with the concept, and I'm going to repeat this as we go through the review, but be familiar with the concept of, hey, the sacral bone is or was 5 bones fused into one. Your os coxae, or your hip bone, was 3 bones at once, and now it's 1, right? So be familiar with those concepts. Number of vertebrae per region, right? So we have cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. If you take the concept of how you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, okay, 7 cervicals, 7 a.m. eat breakfast, 12 thoracics in the middle of the back, so it's the middle of the day, it's noon, so it's 12 thoracics, and then at night you eat dinner at 5 o'clock, so there's 5 lumbar. So 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. 7, 12, and 5, and that kind of goes with the idea of, hey, 7 o'clock breakfast, 12 o'clock lunch, and 5 o'clock dinner. It may not be your schedule, but that's one way of looking at it, and that's one way of remembering 7, 12, and 5. All right. Kind of popped up all together, so let me just go ahead and read this to you. Be familiar with structures and their articulations. So, for example, C2 versus C1. How does C1 attach to C2? How is it held in place? What kind of joint is it? Is it a, oh wait, that's a different chapter. So I think I got ahead of myself at the beginning of the review, so I apologize, because I have another review for you guys in a couple minutes. So anyway, how they articulate together, structures and articulations found on C2 versus C1, how are other areas of C1 and C, how they connect between occiput and C1 and all that. The structures of C1 versus structures of C2, as you recall, C1 and C2 really don't have, or C1 doesn't have a vertebral body. So be familiar with those structures found in the vertebral bodies, or in the vertebra, or vertebra, and how they differ from each other. Okay, you should know that all cervical spine vertebrae have a vertebral foramen. So be familiar with the word foramen, which is a hole, which means something's going through that hole. So when you study the bones and you study the structures of those bones, you go ahead and make sure you know what passes through those structures, as well as that if you can remember that all cervical spine, right, here's a cervical spine, all cervical spines or vertebrae have these vertebral foramen, which allow this vertebral artery to pass through. Okay. I'll turn it around. Right. Here's your occiput. So be familiar with these guys are different than the thoracics, which is different than your rest of your vertebral body. This is really cool. Here's your C1 on top, C2 on the bottom. Okay, they look in the back. C1 looking down at it. Right? It has no vertebral body, right? But we're held together by the dens, which is right here for C2, and then we have all these ligaments that actually hold it in place. So it's pretty interesting. All right. When it comes to the next statement, which is over here, antebrachium, which is your forearm, so be familiar with those terms. Antebrachium is forearm, brachium is arm. Be familiar with the bones of the antebrachium, which is going to be your radius and your ulna. Know which side each one goes on. Make sure you know the structures of those bones as well, because the ulna is different than the radius, and how they kind of meet together up at the elbow area. Know the bones of the shoulder girdle, which means how does your humerus and your glenoid cavity, obviously it's the shoulder girdle contains the scapula with the glenoid tubercle, with the humeral head inserting into the glenoid cavity, which really is just a divot on the scapula. Parts of the mandible. Be familiar with the mandible, and it has the mandibular condyle, which kind of goes ahead and connects with the temporal bone. So be familiar with all the parts and structures of the mandible. Know the hyoid bone and where it's located. Okay, make sure you know that during somebody being choked, obviously it's a bad thing, the hyoid bone will be damaged. Right, so glenoid cavity, make sure you know about that. Like I said, we said fontanelles. Just going to go over real quick what I want you to focus on as well. Antebrachium, we got that. Mandibular. Okay, so mandible. right? They have the condyloid processes as well as the mandibular tubercles and all that fun stuff to think about. The articulation of the head in the spinal column, right? How does the head connect, or how does the occiput connect to your spine? It's usually through the occipital and the C1, or the occipital-lingual junction, occipital-lingual joint. Rib structures and articulations. Okay, how the ribs attach to the vertebrae of the thoracic vertebrae. Make sure you know that there's always they kind of straddle over the vertebral, and they straddle over the intervertebral discs. When it comes to auricular surfaces, okay, or auricular, which is this word right here, means ear, right? It's shaped like an ear. So these auricular surfaces are found on two bones. They're found on the sacrum and on the os coxae. As the sacrum articulates with one of your hips, which is this hand, okay, they kind of articulate at an auricular surface, which would be like an ear on each one, and they go right together. Okay. Be familiar with what I said about the rib articulations. Be familiar with costal cartilages, how they attach to the ribs and the sternums, how bones arise, meaning when I say arise, how they developed. Going back to the fetal questions that I talked about earlier, remember the sacrum starts out as 5 bones and they ends up as 1. The os coxae, which is really called the innominate bone, okay, is 3 bones and then goes into 1. Common structures among different bones. Again, that was my styloid process question, or the idea of the concept that, hey, if we have a styloid process, we have them in multiple locations. Be familiar with different, again, structures of a bone, or structures of entire areas. For example, the skull. Like, the skull won't have an obturator foramen because the obturator foramen is going to be found in the ilium, or the hip, right? It's actually in the ischial portion of the hip, or os coxae. So be familiar with those concepts, or the broad concepts, and there also is some specifics. So we look at the sesamoid bones, and sutural bones can increase bone number by 200, above 206%, or percent, bones themselves. So the question comes around and says, hey, adults can they have more than 206 bones? The answer is yes, they can, because of the sesamoid bones, right? You have sesamoid bones. You have one by your thumb. You have one by your big toe. The patella can be considered a sesamoid bone. Be familiar with terms. What's a condyle? What's a facet? What's a process? Trochanter, or fossa, sulcus, foramen. They all have words, right? It's all Greek, but they all mean something. So when you go ahead and identify the bones, and you have a vertebral foramen, that means you have a hole in the vertebra, or the vertebral area, which is going to contain the vertebral artery, so you're in a cervical spine. If you have a greater trochanter and a lesser trochanter, that means you're on the femur. If you have facets, all your vertebral bodies have facets. They have superior and inferior facets, a lot of condyles, and a lot of fossas to look through and go through. There's one specific area you should be considered to think about when it comes to specifics, right? There is some questions about, hey, what nerve supplies the lower teeth? Okay, but they supply it through this foramen of the mandible in order for the nerves in order to get to the teeth. So it's kind of a specific question, right? So if you have this concept, or how does the nerves come out of the head to go to the structures of the teeth and the mandibles, the maxillary and the mandibular, right? So they usually use the infraorbital foramen, which is right below your eye. You got a supraorbital foramen, infraorbital foramen. That's how it's going to get to the teeth. Be familiar with the concept of hydrocephalus and what alterations could occur as a fetus or a fetal skull. Scoliosis, understand that the lateral scoliosis, the S curves, the C curves, whatever the textbook goes over. Be familiar with the concept of intervertebral foramen. Back that up. Intervertebral discs, and the structures of, meaning what is a disc made of, where are they located, what's their function, what do they do, and then we go from there. when it comes to the one tip for the thoracic region of your spine, those areas, those 12 bones are the most common area for you to find a fused or an unfused vertebrae or vertebra. Meaning that sometimes the vertebral bodies won't be fused. You'll have two, maybe T7, which is your seventh thoracic vertebrae, may have a little separation in the body because it didn't fuse all the way, right? So to have an anomaly, the most common area is going to be in the thoracic area. Cervical, lumbar, they have their own issues, if you would. But for this test, for those that have unfused and fused vertebrae, it's always thoracic area. When we do CPR, right, obviously you should be 2 fingers above the xiphoid process. Just could be just a question that's going to be in there. Xiphoid process is the process right below the sternum. Kind of push on it. It's kind of a cartilage area, but you never want to do CPR on the xiphoid process. It's the landmark where you go right above it. That's where you put your finger or your arms for compressions. Be familiar with the ribs, floating versus true versus false ribs, and numbers. What numbers are the true ribs? What numbers are the false ribs? What numbers are the floating ribs? Understand all the bones of the hands and feet, which means what? That means all the carpals in the hands, okay, what their names, the metacarpals, phalanges, right, proximal, middle, distal, thumb obviously is different. And then have your funny bone, which I went over earlier, which is the medial area of your humerus. All right, chain of articulations. Okay, for example, tibia articulates with the talus of the ankle. So just kind of be familiar with, hey, the humerus will articulate with the radial head as well as the notch or of the ulna, if you would, or the portions of the ulna, and how the knee, which is really just your femur sitting on top of your tibia. So just kind of get a chain of how things are put together. Innominate bone, also known as os coxae, also known as the hip. I just wanted to show you the word innominate so that you understand what part of the body we're talking about. And be familiar with, if you see that word, you're always going to go toward the hip or os coxae. So that should be it for this chapter. Chapter 8 is pretty big, as well as 7 and 9, which I will get through 9 in a little bit, and I will post it as well. So just be familiar with some of those concepts that we went over, okay, and you should have no problem getting the job done. So if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to contact me, and I'll definitely help you. All right, good luck.